Moving Day by Lonnie Honeycutt and illustrated by Wisdom Accounts. Copyright 2023. All rights reserved. United States of America. Heaven is real. The purpose of this story is not to serve as a study on heaven. Instead, it's a combination of what I experienced when I died in 2008 and hopefully good storytelling. I realize there's no amount of description, written or drawn, that can accurately illustrate what entering into heaven will be like for you. Throughout the first part of the story, you'll notice the ethnicity of the main character changes. This is on purpose. I truly believe that there is only one race, the human race. The way we look outwardly is simply cosmetic. Also, in contrast to the companion story about hell, which is illustrated as both male and female, this one depicts a man in the primary role. I've purposely kept the references to the masculinity of the character to a minimum because what happens in this story doesn't depend on gender. But one of the two genders had to be chosen so the story could flow naturally. Regarding angels, I've taken a similar liberty. It's normal for an artist to keep the looks of characters the same or similar. I've chosen not to do this because when I died, I saw many different angels of many different shades. Some much darker or lighter than any skin tone possible here on earth. Not all of them had wings. Not all of them were extremely tall, but all of them were radiant. However, it should be noted that the radiance of the angels was not anywhere close to that of people who are in heaven, because we, humans, have been covered by the blood of Jesus. Finally, you'll notice that at times the main character's perspective changes from being lucid to sluggish, from past to present tense, sometimes in the same thought. This too is on purpose. I think if a person begins their journey in heaven while they're still awake, as opposed to being asleep like I was, their new reality could be startling because heaven is so much more real than anything in this life. I'm not saying that people will be confused about things in heaven, but since it will never get boring, I can only imagine how much we will have to get used to and how much more there will be to explore and learn and discuss. In the here and now, when we go to a different country, things take some getting used to. There's no doubt that heaven will be the most fantastic country we will ever live in. I hope you enjoy Moving Day.
Chapter 1. The End of the Beginning. The hospital was cold. It wasn't just the off-white sterility of the sheets that covered me, or the drabness of the walls, or even the incessant, disinterested beeping of the monitor that kept a check on my vitals that made the hospital cold. This was beyond that kind of cold. It was a cold that comes only from deep, profound helplessness. My family was in the room with me, but they didn't seem to be aware I was aware of them. My eyes felt as though they were as dry as sand in the desert. They burned but only blinked every few minutes, regardless of how much I tried to shut them. Occasionally, I felt a teardrop trickle down my cheek, and someone, usually my child, my beautiful, sweet child, would hurriedly dab at my face with a tissue. My wife, the kindest woman I've ever known, held my hand. She gently squeezed my fingers and mumbled soft prayers through her own tears as both of them comforted me. A thought crossed my mind. The nursing staff must have been doing their jobs well because, other than being a bit tired, I felt fine. I turned my head to tell my family I was still here and had no plans of going anywhere, but my head flopped to one side as if I were a marionette whose strings had been cut. Worse, all my throat would do was gurgle incoherently. So, instead of speaking, I tried to squeeze my wife's hand to let her know I really was okay, but my muscles would only spasm, making my arms and hands twitch as if I were having a seizure. It was frustrating to have my body revolt against me regardless of how much I concentrated and tried to control it. It was even more frustrating not being able to communicate with anyone at all. Well, that's not exactly true. There was someone, but he made me anxious. He was standing in the corner, just behind a nurse, who was trying to be quiet as she typed something on the pad she held. Even when she moved away from the fellow and came closer to me to check my vitals, something she wasn't doing as often as she had in days past, I still couldn't see him well. He looked like a shadow.
"It won't be long now,"
he told me gently and shifted in the doorway. I tried squinting, but my eyes wouldn't focus enough to make out his features. All I knew for certain was that he was a man, and somehow, when he spoke to me, no one else seemed to be able to hear him. The only other thing I knew for certain was I didn't want him here. "Go away," I tried to yell, but my mouth gurgled nonsense. Somehow he'd understood me, and almost as if he were trying to console me, he said softly,
"I can't. But don't worry. I'm here for you."
A chill ran through me. Even though it had been said compassionately, the way he said the word "here" made it sound ominous. A moment later, when someone suddenly entered my room and walked directly through him, it startled me so that my entire body jerked. "Thank God," I laughed, when I realized the person who'd come into the room was my pastor. I tried pointing at the blurry figure in the doorway. "Pastor, please, would you tell him to leave?" Whimpers, like one would expect to hear from someone in physical pain, refocused my attention on my family. They were crying, almost wailing. For a long moment, I didn't know why. Then it finally registered. I was mumbling and my arms were flailing feebly. My pastor took my wife's hand and looked down at me with tears in his eyes, but a small, kind smile on his face. He asked,
"Can I pray for your husband and your family?"
Despite the tears rolling down her cheeks, my lovely wife managed a faint nod. As my pastor started to pray, I saw the man who'd been standing in the doorway move silently beside him and looked down at me. As he moved nearer, I noticed a shimmer surrounding him. The closer he came, the more a warmth that seemed to radiate from his form washed over me. It was comforting. No, not exactly comforting, even though it was that. It was something more. Yes, I had it now. It was a joyful warmth. It was like when I was a child lying in bed while my mother placed warm blankets over me that had just come from the dryer. His radiance felt safe and warm. I strained to make out the shadowy figure's face, but it was like looking through the thick bottom of a glass with a thin film of milk sliding across it. Still, I thought he looked bigger and more solemn than he had a few minutes before. I wasn't scared of him. Instead, I was annoyed at him. Annoyed that someone I didn't know, or rather, couldn't tell if I knew, would be making a nuisance of himself while I was trying my best to get better. I silently wondered, why wouldn't he just leave? As my pastor began to pray, I tried to close my eyes but couldn't. So I just listened while carefully watching the figure behind him.
Father God, thank you for allowing my brother's family to be here with him, and for allowing him to be a good example of what it means to love others as you love us.
Something about his words seemed to relax me. My pastor continued,
Jesus, we are so incredibly happy and humbled that you came to earth as one of us, lived as one of your creations, gave yourself as a sacrifice for all our sins, died for us upon a cross, and raised yourself on the third day to prove you have power over life and death, and to fulfill the scriptures.
As I lay there, my mind began to focus on what Jesus had done for me, for us, for my family, and everyone we'd ever met, and even those we hadn't yet. The room itself didn't seem so cold now that this prayer had refocused me on Christ. I felt the pastor place his fingers over my wife's so that they were now both holding my hand.
Teach us to love you, the way that your brother and your friend and your child, who is coming to your heavenly kingdom, loves you.
My eyes widened when the blurry, shimmering man behind my minister leaned forward, and his face went through the clergyman's chest until he was looking at me from just below my pastor's chin. The sight of him hovering half in and half out of my pastor's body was, at the same time, captivating, mesmerizing, ridiculous, incredible, and, well, weird. Still, despite being no more than a foot or two away from my face, I couldn't quite make out his features. My daughter kissed my forehead as the prayer continued. My mind raced to what the preacher was saying. He asked Jesus to take me into his house and assure me that my family would be okay. The words sounded right and wrong at the same time. It was true that I loved Jesus more than anyone, and I sincerely hoped someone could use me as an example, even though I was certain if they knew all of my faults, no one would ever consider me as their role model. But it was the last part that seemed a bit off. Why was the man talking about me going to Jesus' heavenly kingdom? A faint, barely audible gurgling escaped my throat as I tried to correct him. I didn't want the dear fellow to think I was dying. After all, I had already signed up to help with Children's Church next month. I'd never skip out on my commitments. Besides that, while I wanted to go to heaven, I wasn't ready to leave just yet. But what if he was right? The thought caused a panic so severe my back arched and my head shook. No! I couldn't die just yet. I had to seek his grace for sins I'd forgotten, but now remembered vividly. I wanted to tell my wife I loved her so much that every time I thought of how much we'd been through, my heart wanted to burst from happiness, and I couldn't leave without begging for forgiveness from my child who made me so proud, despite my repeated shameful and selfish actions. When I finally regained my thoughts and brought myself back to the present, my arms were resting heavily on my chest, one hand atop the other. It was a struggle to even look around. I was so tired. A hazy glow, resembling a frosted windshield with headlights reflecting on it, caught my attention and made me squint. After my eyes finally refocused, they widened in a state of confusion. The man, who had been sticking out of my pastor's chest, was now barely 12 inches from me. I still couldn't see his face clearly, even though he was near enough I should have felt his breath. I think my heart skipped a beat when I realized he wasn't breathing. I wondered, what manner of man was he? Then I saw it. His smile. It was a gentle smile. It was also his smile that removed any doubt as to why he was here. With dread, I thought to myself, he had come to take my life. No! I tried yelling, but all I managed was a sad groan. I had no fear of him, but the thought of dying in front of my family by a stranger's hands was unbearable. Determined to warn them, my mind struggled to force a scream, but nothing came, not even the small gurgling that had become my constant companion the past several days. I asked myself, why wouldn't they hear me? Why couldn't they see him? With a Herculean effort, I tried to fling my hands into the air to get everyone's attention, but my arms didn't work any longer. It was as if my entire body was falling into a deep slumber. I couldn't push him away, couldn't warn them, and I knew it. I barely had enough energy to breathe. My pastor's voice drew my attention.
Holy Spirit, thank you for being the down payment for what the Son has done for each of us, and for praying for us when we don't know how to pray for ourselves. Thank you for loving my brother and caring for his family.
For an instant, my vision became clear, and I saw a tear run down the minister's face and dangle off of his smiling lips.
Thank you for being with us and never forsaking us, even when we deserve it.
Suddenly, it felt as if I were fainting. The room contorted, and for long moments, I went in and out of consciousness. I could no longer see as well as I had been able to. Everything started to get fuzzy. My attention moved from my pastor to my wife and child, to a room brimming with people. Somehow I realized the nurse must have told people to come inside to wish me farewell. There were many of the friends and family who'd visited me during the past several days, standing at the foot of my bed, even my doctor. Most of them were solemn, but I think a few of them were sporting small smiles, as if they knew something I'd forgotten. Then I felt a gentle warmth around my hands, as if my wife and child and someone else, possibly my pastor, had intertwined their fingers with mine. An indescribable sense of tranquility and contentment swept through me. To my relief, the shadowy man had disappeared when I looked towards my pastor. The last thing I remember, as I began dozing off, was the minister praying,
Thanks to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit for saving us completely, for promising that regardless of what happens, when we give ourselves to Jesus, nothing, not time or distance or fear or worries or sin or death or anything in all of creation, past, present, or future, will ever be able to separate us from your love.
In a tender voice, he said,
Take care, my friend. Enjoy your new life.
As I let myself relax, I felt the distinct sensation of strong arms lifting me and embracing me, making me feel safe, like a child being held against their parent's chest. From the corners of my eyes, I thought I saw wings. Then, faster than it should have been possible, I was carried towards a destination brighter than the radiance of the sun. As I was drifting off to sleep, my eyes closing in anticipation of finally being able to get some rest, a man's voice suddenly boomed in my ears, and my eyes jerked back open. Chapter 2. The Arrival.
Hey! We're finally here!
I heard someone's voice that was loud and clear and completely joyous. If it hadn't been for the fact that the guy's voice was so cheerful, I might have been annoyed. I tried to find the person to whom the voice belonged, but the sheer brightness of light all around me made it hard to do anything more than blink and squint. After I got used to the light, if I hadn't been sure I was awake, I would have thought I was in a dream because I was clearly outside. As I began looking around to see who had awakened me, I became completely mesmerized by what was under my bare feet, which, curiously enough, looked like the feet I'd had when I was a much younger man. The grass captured all my attention. It sounds crazy, but it's true. For long moments, it was the only thing I could concentrate on. It felt cool and moist and fluffy and substantial and green. I know. How could I feel a color? But somehow I think I did. Maybe it was just that I was overtaken by the beauty of the carpet of green blades. The grass was that amazing. All at once, it ran the gamut of hunter's green to sage and avocado and emerald and tea and sea and, well, all the greens. I bent over to touch the grass, automatically favoring my hip, the one I'd had replaced a while ago, but that had recently started hurting again. Reaching out and running my hand over the plush turf, I realized two things. One, my hip no longer hurt. And two, I was holding my breath. Inhaling deeply, while still touching the grass, my mouth dropped open from utter surprise. The air I smelled was invigorating. The most delightful scent filled my senses. It was like being surrounded by the scent of different fruits in an orchard, with each one having its own distinct fragrance. Deliriously delicious is the way I'd describe it. Standing up, I threw my head back and filled my lungs again just to savor the perfume. Once more, the heady scent caught me off guard, and I took a small step back in a stumble. Frightened, I braced myself for a fall. Strangely enough, my legs felt exceptionally nimble, stronger than I could ever recall, enabling me to effortlessly stay steady. A thrill of excitement ran through me, and I felt the sudden urge to not only laugh, but to jump up and down, almost like a child. No, exactly like a child. Still, something seemed out of place. I shut my eyes, and immediately my mind flooded with questions and conclusions. I must be either dreaming or hallucinating or both. Two questions in particular bothered me. First, how did I get from a hospital bed to the outside without realizing I'd moved? And second, why was I barefooted? I couldn't even think about going outside without shoes because my arthritic feet hurt too much. Yet, here I was. There was something different about here. It had a surreal and sublime quality, unlike anywhere I'd ever been or had even dreamed of. As I stood still, my eyes closed to the world around me, I felt a breeze wash over my body. It swept over my skin and through my hair. Its motion and even its sound refreshed me. It awakened my senses. One thing was certain. If I was dreaming, I wasn't sure I wanted to wake. But I knew my dreams didn't work like this. Instead, my dreams were usually fragmented, and they didn't have the hallmarks of reality like this place did. When I finally opened my eyes, much to my surprise, a man was standing just a few feet away with his back turned towards me. I'd been so taken by my surroundings, I'd completely forgotten he'd been the one who had startled me before I could go to sleep. I don't know how I knew, but he was the same guy who'd been in the room with me only seconds before. Confoundingly, his back was turned and I couldn't see his face, but I did have a good view of the feathered wings coming from his back. Okay, I was fairly certain this was a dream. No one I'd ever met had feathers popping out of their back. Suddenly, a decades-old childhood memory of a family Bible popped into my mind. My mother and father had kept it on our living room table. As a youngster, I became enamored with the photos of Renaissance paintings on its pages. I had been particularly fond of the depiction of angels, which is exactly what this man looked like. For a brief second, I chuckled and thought, so much for reality. Mustering the most authoritative voice I could, a voice I hoped hid how uncertain I really was, I demanded, "Who are you and what do you want?" In a very happy, very excited voice, the man repeated the same words he'd said to me when I'd told him to go away.
I'm here, for you.
He turned around and a bright light surrounded him. It was so bright his face was hidden. Abruptly, he spread his arms, and wings on his back flared out so widely I couldn't see around them. Expectantly, he asked,
So, what do you think of the place?
His question was so unexpected I nearly burst out laughing. Not only was he blocking my view, preventing me from seeing the place, he delivered his inquiry as if he were a real estate agent and was showing me a nicely appointed apartment. Suddenly, I knew who he was. My eyes widened in abject surprise. He looked nothing like I thought he would, nothing like the depictions out of Hollywood or the graphic novels I'd read as a child. But it was him. With crystal clear clarity, I remembered the moment he'd appeared in my hospital room. This angel had made himself known only after all the people in my life had gathered at the hospital. He never moved from the doorframe until my pastor began praying for me. Only then did he come nearer. And I realized now it hadn't been a friend who had joined hands with my wife and child and touched mine. It had been him. My mind finally put two and two together, and I knew. I thought to myself, he was death. The Grim Reaper turned in a circle so quickly I had to duck so his wings didn't knock me over. Gleefully laughing, Death raised his hands in the air as if he were tossing a pizza crust. He said,
Let's do something fun. Act like no one is watching and laugh or run or jump or dance. Do whatever makes you happy.
I stood frozen. Frankly, I didn't know what to do. So I did nothing, except for keeping my eyes on the deadly, if angelic, figure before me. His wings fluttered like I'd seen birds do when they get wet. And, if it were possible, they became even bigger and more impressive. Seeing that I wasn't going to take him up on his suggestion to dance, he said,
You must be full of questions? While I can't answer certain things, I can answer others. So, go ahead. Ask away.
If nothing else, he was correct about the questions. I had so many questions. For example, where exactly were we? When and why did he make the decision to kill me? Especially since I thought it was obvious I was ready to go home with my family. Why was everything so bright and unnaturally vibrant? Where was that beautiful scent coming from? I settled on a question and asked, Why don't I have shoes on? Both our jaws dropped open simultaneously. I'm certain he had the same thought as me. Of all the questions I might have asked, why that one?
Because you don't need them,
he answered. I could hear the suppression of a snicker, and I thought I saw a broad grin spread across his face. But I wasn't sure because he was so shiny. As if his answer told me everything I needed to know, Death walked closer to me and held out his hand. He continued,
You don't need anything here, because all of here is yours. Really, everything is yours. Do you understand now?
Absent-mindedly, I rubbed my eyes and shook my head as if to clear away cobwebs. I looked at him again and blinked a few times. In a voice that brimmed with excitement, Death asked,
Am I getting clearer?
What?
You're starting to be able to see me better now. And my voice sounds different than what it did in the hospital, right?
Yes, but how did you know?
Well, it takes some people a bit of time at first to adjust. But once you're away from there, things start to become clearer quickly.
Death was still holding his hand out. I hesitated because I didn't want to be distracted, or worse, destroyed, by touching a creature who looked like a living example of a museum painting. I stepped back from the outstretched hand. Death tilted his head and grinned a sly grin, as if he were privy to an inside joke.
Go ahead. Take my hand. It's okay. I promise.
He skipped towards me in a manner I wouldn't have imagined any adult doing, unless they were on heavy medication. But somehow it didn't seem awkward for him. It actually looked fun. Sarcastically, I said, I wish I could jump around like that. Ignoring the way I'd spat my words out like an irritated child, he began skipping around me, his wings flopping and bobbing up and down as he did.
Why can't you? It's fun. Try it. It really is fun.
He laughed.
I double promise.
I said the first thing that came to mind. My arthritis. I can't because it's even hard for me to walk. Skidding to a halt a few feet from me, his voice was tinged with confusion as he asked,
What? No, it isn't.
I rolled my eyes. He must have seen me do so because he lowered his hand and said kindly,
Really? Trust me. It really doesn't hurt anymore.
Listen, I know my body. I've lived in it for... His sudden burst of laughter stopped me mid-sentence. As he spoke once again, his words were powerful and melodic and had a palpable quality to them. It was as if I could feel musical notes flowing towards me and over me and even through me. As if bewildered, he asked loudly,
Don't you understand? You are free.
With that, he tossed his head back, threw his arms open wide, and started spinning around, just like I used to do as a child when I played and wanted to get dizzy. Death laughed again. It was the most joyful and carefree laugh I had ever heard. Then he pointed at me as if saying, It's your turn. I didn't move, but I was secretly trying to stretch my arms and legs to feel the familiar pain. I was completely baffled when I realized. It really was gone. Still twirling and laughing and hooting and hollering, he yelled happily towards the sky.
Really free!
Despite myself, I chuckled. Death must have danced for another half-minute before realizing I was staring at him with a bemused and confused look on my face. When he abruptly skidded to a stop, his wings wrapped completely around his body. The only things I could see were his sandaled feet and the top of his head. He approached me in swift, tiny baby steps. He looked like a shiny butterfly trying to walk while still encased in its feathery cocoon. His voice was muffled by the feathers through which he spoke.
Do you want to see what I really look like? Because you should be able to by now.
The winged spirit stood still, hidden from my view. I stepped backwards, knowing he was about to reveal his true self. My heart raced, and my entire body flushed, from anticipation or hesitation. I'm not sure which. Not knowing what else to do, I waited. His voice, radiating brightness and a hint of teasing laughter, echoed from the feathery case. I heard him playfully say,
I know you want to see me.
I felt two contradictory emotions, joyful irritation, as he gently taunted me. His tone was friendly and warm, like a close friend about to share an exciting secret. I watched as he began hopping around, making a gentle pitter-patter sound, until he hopped directly in front of me and came to a stop. Then he slowly began leaning towards me. His immense wings dipped closer until their outer feathers touched my forehead. As soon as they did, I realized a few things. First, they were much taller and fuller up close than they looked even a few feet away. Second, they were incredibly soft, almost as if they were made out of the whispers of a cotton ball. Third, they were warm and otherworldly fragrant. I wanted to reach out and bury my face in them, but I dared not do so. I reminded myself who was standing before me. Hesitantly, Death spoke from behind his feathers.
Can you help a fellow out? It seems well, if you'd be so kind as to open my feathers, I'd be ever so grateful.
My eyes widened in surprise.
Hello? Are you still there?
He asked softly. Was he serious? Was Death actually stuck behind his own wings? The question made me wonder. If he really was stuck, perhaps I could hide. Then I'd not have to see his hideous face when his feathers opened. But I knew it didn't matter. Even if I ran, I was too old to make a getaway. Even if I got a head start, this creature had yelled and danced about, and he'd done so without getting out of breath. No. This man had supernatural stamina, whereas I needed a cane to be sure I stayed upright. A cane I realized I didn't have at the moment. Again, Death's muffled voice called out to me.
Hey! Hello? You didn't run away, did you?
Ignoring him, I took a moment to look around at where we were. I'd been so startled by Death's antics, I hadn't really looked at my surroundings. Due to his giant wings, I couldn't see what was behind him. However, behind me and to the left and right, I could see we were in an orchard bordered by miles and miles of flowers and fruit trees. Somehow it managed to look both wild and manicured at the same time, as if it knew the limits of where it was supposed to grow, and not one blade exceeded those parameters. Above us, I saw clouds that seemed to swirl and zigzag and dip. Then I spotted something else. My mouth dropped open in shock. The clouds weren't just clouds. Among the clouds, believe it or not, but you can believe it, were angels flying to and fro. If you're like me, and you probably are, you might think I was hallucinating. I certainly thought so, but no. I watched them for long seconds and saw they really were angels. Not the chubby cherubs seen in so many depictions, but fully grown. People? For the first time, the question crossed my mind, do people become angels? If so, why didn't I have wings? Then it dawned on me. I hadn't checked. So, I looked over my shoulders and felt behind my back. Nope. I didn't have wings. I was still human. It made sense because we aren't angels by nature. As I turned my gaze back skyward, I realized I wasn't wearing my glasses. Still, I was seeing clearer than ever before. Have you ever had a realization that something about you, or your location, or both, was dramatically different? That's how I'd felt ever since I'd found myself here. Only now, I was more convinced of it than ever. I decided that even if this were an illusion, it felt good. More than that, I felt great. Better than I had in a long, long time. Maybe ever. Death, who had stopped asking for my help, was now tapping his foot on the ground, as if impatiently waiting for me to volunteer my help. But instead of prying open his cage of feathers, I leaned as far to my left as possible to look behind him. Somehow, he anticipated my plan and swayed his body, so he foiled me. I tried leaning to my right, but he did the same. I walked a step or two to my left and tried to dart past him, so he waddled sideways and blocked my path. I tried backing up, but he followed me. It was irksome. For a full minute, I, an ambling old man, tried every way I could think of to see past Death. Somehow, even though I was quite certain he couldn't see me, he countered my every move. From behind his wings, Death laughed. Not the eerie, bone-chilling noise I assumed his true voice would be, but a hearty, echoing guffaw. Finally, I screwed up the courage to reach out and rip his wings open. I grimaced in anticipation, but to my utter surprise, the moment I touched his feathers, both of his wings popped open as if on springs. Death dropped to one knee.
Surprise!
He yelled. His actions startled me as if I were a baby who'd just learned to play peekaboo. Unable to stop myself, I laughed out loud.
There you are. That's the man I've been waiting to see.
For long moments, he and I chuckled and laughed together. My conflicting emotions must have registered on my face because Death, still grinning widely, asked,
What's wrong?
I'm not sure, I said sincerely. While my response was the truth, there was something I wanted to ask, but I was clueless about how to go about it without seeming foolish. Well, I started, then hesitated. Shrugging my shoulders, I decided to throw caution to the wind and just tell him, I never expected you to be so happy. My statement came out like a question.
Why not? Why wouldn't I be? I get to escort people like you to here every day. What's not to be happy about?
I couldn't believe he would be so happy about his job. Well, yes, but I searched my mind for a way to explain exactly what I meant, but couldn't find the words. So I just said what I thought. Your death, right? The angel of death? What happened next was so surprising, the slightest of breezes could have knocked me over. Death burst into a laughing fit so loud, I cringed and looked around, half expecting someone to shout at him to be quiet. He pointed a finger at me as he fell and balanced himself on one hand, laughing harder and harder until he finally flopped onto the ground and lost his sandals. I think if his joy hadn't been so apparent, I might have been totally embarrassed, but there was no maliciousness in his laugh. As he giggled and snickered and chortled, I began laughing at the absurdity of him laughing at me. I have no idea why I was laughing except that the emotion he exuded, that of rapturous happiness, seemed contagious. Honestly, between pauses of our breaths and heaves of guffaws, I think I heard the rocks and trees laughing at and with us. It was surreal. Finally, Death got himself under control. He stood up, holding his belly. Still laughing, he looked at me and said simply,
No, I'm not.
Wiping the dampness away from my eyes, I cocked my head like I'd seen puppies do when they're confused. I'd completely forgotten what question was being answered. No, you're not what?
Death,
He said, and before I could move away, he grabbed hold of me. Squeezing me in a tight hug, I felt his wings wrap around us until all I could see were feathers, his face, and the white tunic worn by the young man. Amazingly, even though his wings were closed around me, there was light everywhere. Smiling, he lifted me up by my armpits as if I were as light as a baby. Still giggling, he talked to me as he held me aloft.
I'm not Death. Death is what people go through to get to the other place. But people like you are his, so you don't go there. You go here. I'm just your escort.
But, I tried to argue, I saw you in my hospital room. Are you sure you're not the angel of death?
No, yes.
A gleeful chuckle slipped from his lips.
No, I'm not the angel of death. There's no such thing. Besides that, you're not dead. Those who are in hell are dead to him, but not those who belong to him. None of you die, ever. Don't you remember his promise? I'd never forget a promise like that if I were one of you. As for me, I'm the angel assigned to bring you here.
He spun me round, wrapped his arms around me, and squeezed my back to his chest. Then his wings parted, revealing a sight I never expected. It's something you'll have to see to understand. For a second time, I forgot to breathe. My eyes widened and my mouth once more fell open. What I saw before, below and above me, is beyond my capacity to describe. Rivers and streams, valleys and hills and mountains, fluffy white clouds, and more of the angels I'd seen earlier. Trees and shrubs and flowers, everything and anything beautiful. It stretched for miles and miles and miles all around us. My guide must have seen my delight because he pointed down towards a field, and it was my turn to giggle. My eyes danced with joy. Below us, I watched as a tiny dog played with a bison. A jungle cat lay on its back while a raccoon played with the big cat's tail as it lazily swished back and forth. A cobra slithered alongside a mischief of mice as they playfully darted around, sometimes landing on the snake and riding a while, then leaping off. A young baboon petted a kitten, and so many more animals, tiny and huge, played. No, that's not the right word. They weren't just playing together. They were frolicking. When I was finally able to speak, I asked in a broken, disjointed voice, "But I thought animals don't have souls."
You're right, they don't.
Then how are they here?
Do you really think that the creator of everything wouldn't be able to recreate an animal or plant or anything else that's existed? Don't be silly. Just as he knit your body together in your mother's womb, knew what you'd look like, knew everything you'd ever go through and every decision you'd ever make. He also knows every individual quirk and what color they are. So, making an animal is not a big feat. The fact is, there is nothing that's a big feat for him.
Before I could form the words, the angel grabbed my hand and spun me out to his side as if we were dancing. I was afraid I was going to fall, but I didn't. Instead, I floated in the air, an arm's length away from my guide, connected only by our fingertips. Turning his head towards a row of trees that had golden leaves, he yelled to someone in a language that sounded like music to me. The sound of clapping caught my attention, and I saw the comely, dark-skinned angel he'd called to. Still clapping and smiling at the sight of us, he yelled up to us from among the trees.
"Glad you're here. And yes, they're here too."
Startled, I looked at my chaperone. Smiling, he told me.
Everyone wants to know the answer to that question.
A moment later, I was embraced by my guide in a warm, joyful hug. Without warning, I was overwhelmed, completely overcome by emotion. My heart swelled. A new expression unfolded across my face, one of unbridled elation, and I smiled exuberantly. To say I was overjoyed would have been an understatement of massive proportions. After I got through another burst of unbridled laughter, I finally managed to ask, "How is all of this possible?" My companion shrugged his shoulders and said simply,
He wants here to be perfect. So, it is.
It was then I noticed the ground below us passing quickly. I saw flowers of every kind imaginable. All of them, the small and the humongous, were beautiful and in full bloom. Fruit trees drooped heavily from their bounty. In awe, I watched as we passed streams and lakes whose waters glistened as if diamonds floated on them. Above us, birds and angels played together. They darted in and out of clouds that were billowy and wispy, long and furrowed in scrunched up ripples, and whiter than freshly packed snowy mountaintops. Quickly, as if you were trying to make my belly tickle like it does when you suddenly go down and then up on a highway, we descended through a canopy of trees. Their leaves brushed and rustled against us. We landed beside a beautifully sculpted walkway in a forest that went as far as the eye could see. I was so taken with the view, I missed seeing another angel until he spoke to us. Just like my supernatural companion, he was smiling, bubbly even. His robed arm swept outward, and he spun in a circle until his brown eyes were once again on us, and he asked,
"Do you like it?"
An even bigger smile spread across his face when I looked at him in stunned silence. I finally managed a simple nod.
"Oh, good. I'm very glad."
There was a childlike innocence in his voice, which made him sound proud, but not prideful. As if it were a relief, I truly liked what I was seeing. It was impossible for my face not to break into a wide grin. I turned to talk to my angel, to ask a question, only to find he was no longer beside me. The forest angel, which was what he was in my mind, caught my attention, put a conspiratorial finger to his lips, then thumbed behind him. Leaning to the right, he moved his wings. Behind him, I saw my courier happily skipping through the gentle water. For a long moment, I just stared. How is it, I wondered, that these beings could be so happy and carefree?
"Come on, let's go and play."
The forest angel stood up and stepped into the water. Seconds later, I was watching two angels rollicking about in the water as if they were children. More elation than I thought was possible coursed through my body, and I laughed, really laughed. Tentatively, I moved closer to the stream and dipped my toe in it. At once I experienced two different sensations, a flash of energy shot through my body, literally from the tips of my toes to the top of my head, and almost as quickly as I registered the energy, my body relaxed. I was more than amazed or shocked. I was gobsmacked. I immediately thought of the story about how a blind man was healed when mud was smeared on his eyes. After he washed in the pool of Siloam, he could see again. Until that moment, I had never considered how often Jesus had used water to bring about change. Then I saw my reflection. I was awestruck. Silently, I gazed at myself, a decades younger man with a full head of dark hair. Without warning, my angel swooped me up, carried me high into the sky. Instantly, my attention was drawn to a city in the distance. Even though it should have been a dot at that distance, it was immediately recognizable. It was huge and bright and shiny and shimmering, as if light was cascading off of jewels. My eyes were still fixated on the site of the city when we began to descend. Finally, the trees blocked it from my view as we landed. My escort asked me,
"Are you ready to go?"
Without waiting for my answer, he began briskly walking away, and I jogged to catch up with him. Then he started running. I had to run to keep up. As we ran, I felt the grass beneath my feet, the cool air rushing past my face, jostling my hair, and then I remembered my knees. "Wait!" I yelled, almost panicked. We both stopped abruptly. As if he already knew I'd stopped, he asked,
"Feels wonderful, doesn't it?"
Ecstatic doesn't come close to the feelings that flowed through me after I realized I'd been running without pain. "How?"
"I told you.
he said, and feigned exasperation.
You're free here. No more pain, no more sorrow, no more fear, and no more tears. Only comfort and happiness and joy and, well, everything good."
I looked at the angel standing before me. I knew my next question was going to sound idiotic. Still, I had to make sure. "Does that mean we're in heaven?" The angel before me slowly turned his head, as if surveying the land. I mimicked him, trying to absorb all the wondrous beauty. Finally, he raised one eyebrow, chuckled, and asked in a playfully sarcastic voice,
"You're a little slow on the uptake, aren't you?"
With a playful wink of his eye and a tap on my shoulder, he turned and motioned for me to follow. We ran into a clearing before he slowed. Between strides, I asked, "Where are we going?"
"To the city you saw."
"But that's so far away," I hesitated. "What'll we do when night falls? Won't it be too dark to travel?" Turning round to face me, he continued walking backward as we talked.
"Night?
His voice was filled with amusement.
Night is for there. Darkness is for the other place."
Turning back, he raised his hands high and spoke in a language I'd never heard before. Somehow, I knew he was praising God. The angel spun around and, with the most sincere expression imaginable, he continued,
"My friend, you are here, and here it is never night, and darkness isn't allowed, because the sun is here, and he is the light, and today you get to meet him, face to face."
I almost screamed with joy, but then I began to recall all of the deeds I'd done, terrible things, things that no one could possibly be forgiven of. My steps faltered, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. I felt only desperation. The angel walked back to me, still smiling, still as happy as ever.
"I know what you're thinking. I've seen that look millions of times."
Normally, when someone used a phrase like millions of times, it was understood they were exaggerating to make a point. But even in the deep throes of dismay, I knew not to doubt exactly what the winged messenger claimed. Still, I knew what he didn't. I knew all the times I'd betrayed the love of Christ, all the times I'd fallen back into my old ways, all the times I doubted and worried and sinned. "You don't understand," my head slumped forward. "If you only knew what I've done, you'd know I'll never be let in." Beneath my chin, I felt a strong finger lifting my head. A peace that surpassed anything I've ever known washed over me.
"No, it's you who don't understand what he has done so that he can let you in. That's why I'm here. You are already in."
He winked at me, and his voice softened.
Not a single angel, none of us, have a clue as to why or how he did what he did for you, but that's okay. He's the author of your salvation, the King of Kings, and you're one of his children. I remember singing and dancing the morning you repented and asked Jesus to be your Savior. All of us are so happy you're here.
Looking at me kindly, he shrugged his shoulders as if he were okay with not understanding. Slapping me playfully on my shoulder, he motioned for me to follow.
Come on, your father and a lot of others can't wait to see you.
With that, my welcoming angel danced away, twirling himself in the air, landing and running between trees, ducking behind bushes and peeking out at me, waving his hands and arms, just like I used to do with my friends when I was a kid. And me, what did I do? Well, as we made our way towards the city, whose light I could still see in the far, far distance, I joined in the fun. It really was the beginning.
Thank you so much for listening to Moving Day by Lonnie Honeycutt and Wisdom Accounts. Hopefully you've enjoyed this audio video book. If you have, please feel free to check out our other titles. And be on the lookout for I Am Alive and Not at All Well, the companion to Moving Day from the perspective of a person suffering in hell. Thanks again, and may God bless you.